Welcome back, everyone, to our third and final panel for this year's Global Social Justice Research Symposium. I'm Professor Arjun Shankar. I am in the Culture and Politics program here in the School of Foreign Service, and of course, I'm the Research and Faculty Director of the CSJ. I hope I see some of you all in my office, in my classes. Would love to talk to you both in and outside of the classroom. This final panel, we've got 3 presentations. The first by Evan Bianchi, the second by Ali Schlicht and Fatia Fasasi, and the last by Noriko O'Shea. Our first presentation is going to be by Evan Bianchi, who was a Provost Distinguished Undergraduate Research Fellow. This fellowship is designed to enhance student engagement in rigorous scholarly research over the summer and is open to sophomores and juniors from across all majors. So if you're a freshman, apply before your sophomore year, or if you're a sophomore, apply before your junior year. And with that, Evan, please do come up. And I forgot a couple things, Evan, sorry, because of course I did. Oh, I don't want to do that. Unmute.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I will be presenting today on the research I conducted this summer on the role of education setting transitions between pre-K and kindergarten on student social emotional outcomes in kindergarten and beyond. And this is analysis featuring low-income students from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, before I officially begin, there are several people I would like to thank for making this research possible, the first of whom being Dr. Anna Johnson, my mentor in the Child Development and Social Policy Lab. Without her support, none of this research would have been possible. I'd also like to thank Dr. Lauren Tuckley and the entire CRF for awarding me the Provost Fellowship and enabling me to conduct this research. And then I also want to give a special shout out to Dr. Craig, Dr. Husseini, Dr. Whistler, and Professor Winter from our Education and Social Justice Fellowship. I, for a variety of reasons, was unfortunately never able to complete the fellowship, but I had an incredible experience working with this group for 2 years, and they were the ones who gave me the opportunity to present today. So thank you to you all. Now, I would like to start with a quote from abolitionist and writer Frederick Douglass. "It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men." This is a quote that we actually have on our wall in the Child Development and Social Policy Lab. And I want to start with this as a grounding principle to all of the research that we do, which is utilizing the knowledge of sensitive periods in child development to craft interventions to build more equitable societies. Now, with that, in order to kind of situate how this project began, I think it's helpful to start with some context. So in the Child Development and Social Policy Lab, we use research collected through the Tulsa SEED study, or the School Experience and Early Development Study. This study is based in Tulsa, Oklahoma, because Oklahoma was one of the first states in the nation to institute a universal pre-K program. So this means that pre-K is offered through the public school to all students in Oklahoma. This is an observational and longitudinal study. It was started in 2016 when students were 3 years old. Students were sampled from low-income families through early childhood programs that predominantly or exclusively serve families who are at a poverty level income. And our initial sample was around 1,300 children. We are still following about 1,000 of them today. The students just entered 6th grade. So we've been following them for several years now, and we're going to actually continue to follow them through 9th grade. And part of this study includes annual 360-degree data collection. So that means every year we do direct child assessments, classroom observations, teacher surveys, parent surveys, and school and state level administrative data. Now, there is an abundance of literature in the field documenting the benefits of high quality early childhood education. And this is true to, like, so much so that we have policy interventions as a direct result of this research. This is why we have the Head Start program. The expansion of pre-K access is one of the major goals of the Biden-Harris administration. So we're now at a point as a field where kind of proving the benefits of pre-K is no longer our goal. Our goal is policy-informing research and trying to figure out ways to maximize the enabling of equitable preschool access for all. So through this study, we have students coming from a myriad of pre-K backgrounds. We have students attending the Tulsa Public Schools pre-K program, or TPS. We have students attending Head Start or Educare, which follows the similar Head Start model. And then we also have students who stayed home with a care provider before starting compulsory education in kindergarten. So we've been able to see in our research and other research groups doing similar work that there is this general tendency that our TPS or public school pre-K attenders will outperform the Head Start students on academic and social emotional outcomes upon entering kindergarten. And this has been widely attributed to simply the fact that Head Start, by definition, serves low-income students, and that means that these students have kind of long-lasting demographic characteristics that are unfortunately associated with negative outcomes. However, there are additional differences between the Head Start and the TPS program, one of which being the location, like the setting of these programs. The TPS, if you are a student attending TPS pre-K, you are attending this education in a school setting. And it is a setting where you can stay in that school from pre-K into kindergarten and beyond. Whereas Head Start is only for pre-K. And so Head Start students are required to change schools or transition schools from pre-K to kindergarten. And it is this potential role of school transitions that was the impetus for this research. So past research into transitions has shown that school transitions at any age have been associated with losses in student engagement, declines in student psychological well-being, increase in depressive symptoms, weakened self-esteem, and cascading effects of externalizing problems and academic competence. Furthermore, transitions have been linked with heightened odds of significant deflection in developmental and behavioral trajectories. They tend to feature new and unfamiliar norms, values, and expectations, which can bring with them a whole new set of challenges and stressors. And like most milestones in child development, transitions provide opportunities for both adaptive and maladaptive social and emotional development. And it is this differentiation that can result in inequalities that persist across the life's course. So having established that transitions can potentially have negative outcomes, we must ask, well, who are at risk for these negative outcomes? And so far, the literature has pointed to these systematic differences, including socioeconomic status, race and ethnicity, and other dimensions of stratification as playing a role in the well-documented divergence of educational careers. And researchers have really kind of combined this whole theory under a notion of resources, and that students who have fewer social, financial, and flexible resources will be less resilient to the challenges posed by transitions and therefore more at risk for the negative outcomes. Now, hopefully at this point, I have established that two things. One, that early childhood is a sensitive period for child development, and that experiences in that time can have long-lasting effects. And two, that transitions can be stressful periods, and that for those who lack the necessary resources to adaptively meet those stresses, transitions can lead to negative outcomes. And it is at this point that we come to an unfortunate gap in the literature, which is that transitions research has never before been applied to the sensitive period of early childhood. All of the research that I have previously cited has come from students in elementary, middle, and even high school, but none have ever looked at this extremely sensitive period in development, and it is this gap in the literature that I am hoping this research will start to help fill. So with that, my hypothesis is that transitions from pre-K to kindergarten is a sensitive period for child development, and one that can result in negative outcomes for children who lack the necessary resources, including low-income students. As a result, I predict that students who transition from Tulsa Public Schools pre-K to a different educational setting for kindergarten will on average experience negative social emotional outcomes documented in kindergarten, including reductions in emotional control, behavioral regulation, executive functioning, student-teacher relationships, and peer relationship quality compared to their peers who do not transition. Now, I will briefly go through our sample As I mentioned earlier, this whole study kind of came out of this notion of the differences between Head Start and TPS. However, for the sake of this study, I chose to focus solely on TPS students, because as I noted, there are demographic differences between Head Start and TPS students, in addition to slight differences in sort of the educational plan of Head Start and TPS. So just to reduce any confounding variables, I focused solely on TPS students. So this results in a sample of 865 students. 571 of these students did not transition. So they stayed at the same TPS school for pre-K and for kindergarten. And then 294 of these students did transition. And so for the sake of time, I'm just gonna go kind of straight to the results. This is pretty much all of the data analysis for this was done using logistic regression models. So here you can see this is a measure. These are all the measures used are parent or teacher reported, and they are valid like NIH measures. This one specifically is a measure of executive function that also includes subscales for emotional control and behavioral regulation. So as you can see here, we did get significant differences between our between our transition and non-transition groups documented in spring of kindergarten. So for example, for emotional control, we see that these students were more likely to be attributed by their teachers as small events trigger big reactions, or that they become upset too easily. And then for behavioral regulation, we have attributions like the child is wild or out of control, or they have trouble putting the brakes on their actions. And then this is from the teacher observation and classroom adaptation measure, and you can see that this measure breaks behavior down to prosocial and disruptive behavior. And once again, we see significant results with the transition group reporting lower rates of prosocial behavior, and so these are concentrates, is friendly, shows empathy and compassion. And then we see higher rates among the transition group for disruptive behavior. And these include breaking rules, doesn't get along with others, is easily distracted. Next, we have student-teacher relationship. And this is broken down into closeness and conflict. So again, we're seeing that our students who transitioned, they are on average being rated lower by their teachers in terms of like their applicability to statements such as the teacher shares an affectionate and warm relationship with the child, or if upset, the child will seek comfort from the teacher. And then similarly, in terms of conflict, we're seeing that these students are being rated more highly. So these statements apply more to the transition group compared to the non-transition group of the child is always struggling, like the child and I, being the teacher, are always struggling with each other, or that the child remains angry or resistant post-discipline. And then our final measure is, this is the Penn Interactive Peer Play Scale. This is a scale looking at peer relationships, and it uses the fact that in early development, the major way that peer relationships are forming is through play, so it's focusing on that, and we see that positive peer behavior, again, lower for the transition group, and then the transition group is also specifically higher on disconnectedness in play. So while all these findings are very exciting and very informative, there is certainly significant research to go, which I'll be continuing throughout this next year. But in conclusion, these preliminary findings suggest that low-income students who transition education settings between pre-K and kindergarten are at risk for negative social emotional outcomes, including reductions in emotional control, behavioral regulation, executive functioning, student-teacher relationship quality, and peer relationship quality. Based on these findings, policymakers should work to reduce these potentially negative transitions, and a potential way of doing this would be embedding pre-K within the public school system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evan. As somebody who started my career in K through 12 education, I can definitely attest to the fact that we need more research in this area and that transition matters a lot. So thank you for starting that, and I hope you do more on this subject. Next, we have two Ledlow scholars, Ali Schlicht and Fatia Fasasi. The Laidlaw Scholars Program supports an independent and faculty-mentored project during a 6-week research project and allows participants to develop their leadership skills and research experiences. Ali and Fatia were selected for the program at the end of their first year at Georgetown. So let's welcome them up.
Hello, my name is Fatia Fasasi. I am a sophomore in the School of Health, planning on majoring in healthcare management and policy, pre-med student, and I'm from Dallas, Texas.
And hi, my name is Ali Schlicht. I'm a sophomore in the School of Foreign Service, studying international politics with a planned minor in education, inquiry, and justice, and I'm from La Crosse, Wisconsin. This summer, we conducted research under the supervision of Dr. Melanie White, Dr. Nicole Ramsey, the Laidlaw Scholars Foundation, and the Georgetown Center for Research and Fellowships.
Our research is called the Black Central Americans Project, which is a digital public humanities initiative to explore and advance Black Central American history, scholarship, and culture. Through its core mission, the BCA project provides a transdisciplinary and transnational platform that fosters discord and hosts innovative programming within the field of Black Central American studies.
We were involved in the first phase of this project called Constellating Black Central America. Our research will be put on an interactive and creative digital mapping platform, which will illuminate the histories, cultures, and migration patterns of Black and Black Indigenous Central American communities across Central and North America.
The primary objective of our phase was to record and visually represent historical and current data related to Black diasporic movements, an effort to generate new insight into migration patterns and to address a significant gap in Caribbean digital scholarship.
The digital map that will be created will be valuable for historians, sociologists, anthropologists, artists, and non-traditional and independent scholars.
So, how did we achieve this? First, we conducted primary and secondary literature review to further understand our understanding on these cities. Then we gathered incredible sites from social media, and lastly, we each wrote a research report on Black history, politics, and culture for the following city: San Miguel, El Salvador; Livingston, Guatemala; Panama City, Panama; Colón, Panama; Limón, Costa Rica; and La Ceiba, Honduras.
Now we're going to take a closer look into just a couple of these cities, starting off with San Miguel, El Salvador. In 1541, many enslaved Africans were forced to work in the gold mines around San Miguel. During the colonial era, several towns and cities had majority African populations. Today, despite around 7,000 Salvadorans self-identifying as Afro-descendant, Afro-Salvadoran history is often overlooked. Throughout Salvadoran history, several mixed-race communities, including the mulatto and Zambo communities, formed. Racially mixed children were free under Spanish law, which promoted a desire for mixing and whiteness, as well as the erasure and stigma surrounding Blackness. Despite the systemic erasure of Blackness in El Salvador, African heritage still appears in the culture and language. For example, there are several Salvadoran cultural elements that have African roots, including la cochinita, pictured here, plantains, and añil. Here are some important Afro-Salvadoran institutions and notable figures. Afrodescendientes Organizados Salvadoreños, or AFRUS, is a Salvadoran organization that works to recognize and fight for the Afro-Salvadoran population's rights. Also, Zaira Maluska Funes is an Afro-Salvadoran American. She created her page, Scent and Beauty, in 2017 to create a space to celebrate Central American culture and beauty. Brina Nunez is an Afro-Salvadoran Guatemalan cartoonist from the Bay Area. Their comic, I Exist, shown here, focuses on Nunez's questioning of their Afro-Salvadoran identity. Prudencia Ayala was a Salvadoran Afro-Indigenous writer, activist, and fighter for women's rights. She was the first woman to run for president in El Salvador and Latin America as a whole. Although her presidential nomination was ultimately rejected, her leadership and activism sparked a growing debate about women's suffrage, which was granted in 1950. There have been and continue to be several Afro-Salvadoran social movements as well. In 1932, thousands of campesinos, or peasant workers, Afro-Salvadorans, and indigenous people came together to rebel against General Martinez's authoritarian regime. However, unfortunately, the government's military crushed the rebellion, now referred to as La Matanza, or the massacre. Following La Matanza, in 1933, a migration law was passed which prohibited, quote, the migration of any members of the black race, among other groups. The law fueled a persisting narrative that in El Salvador, Africans are from elsewhere, which has carried to today when Afro-Salvadorans are still unrecognized. Still, workers' solidarity in resisting the regime was just one instance of Afro-Salvadorans continuing to fight against injustice. The digital sphere has also been an essential place for Afro-Salvadoran recognition and activism, especially today. AFROS uses its Instagram platform to highlight the stories of Afro-descendants as well as promote events and celebrations. These pictures are actually just from the last 2 months of things. They're very active and highly recommend you check them out. Additionally, the Day of Salvadoran Afro-Descendants is celebrated on August 29th each year, and its goal is to promote heritage, culture, respect, and the realization of the fundamental freedoms and rights of Afro-descendants.
Now let's take a closer look at Livingston, Guatemala, and the population of the Garifuna. Originally refers to as Black Carib, the community known as Garifuna, their journey began in 1653 after a shipwreck near St. Vincent, where survival integrated with indigenous Caribbean people. However, in the 17th century, British forces invaded St. Vincent, and by 1796, the Garifuna population was forcibly relocated to Rotan, an island in Honduras. From there, they spread along the Caribbean coast and eventually established settlements which include Livingston and Guatemala. Throughout their history, the Garifuna population and other enslaved Africans resisted colonial oppression in various ways. Many formed Moron society in remote areas escaping from colonial authorities. Their resistance also took form in many ways, such as revolts and legal petition to secret initiative where they learned to read and write. Artistic expression also played a significant role where music, dance, and storytelling became powerful tools for cultural preservation. Songs like Yuriman and dances like Punta conveyed a message of resistance and help pass down cultural heritage through generation. Today, the Garifuna population in Livingston continue to maintain a strong cultural identity. In 2001, UNESCO recognized the Garifuna language, dance music as a masterpiece of oral and intangible heritage of humanity, highlighting one of their global significance. These are some of the organizations that are prominent in fighting for Black social movement in Livingston. First, we have the Organización Negra Centroamericana. This organization was founded to advance the integral development of Afro-Central American community and combat racism and discrimination. ONEGA extended its influence by founding ONEGUA, which is Organización Negra de Guatemala, in 1995, which played a pivotal role in raising awareness about issues affecting the Afro-descendant population. These two organizations worked tirelessly to ensure that these communities had a voice in national and regional dialogues, while also advocating for policy to promote social justice, equality, and cultural recognition. Lastly, we have Organización Fraternal Negra Honduras. In my research, I also wanted to highlight key institutions and people who contributed to each city. First, we have the Garifuna Cultural Center, whose central mission is to empower island family and share the captivating and impactful Garifuna culture within the global community. Then we have a beautiful and spiritual attraction called the Seven Ataras. And then we have activists such as Tomas Sanchez and Juan Carlos Sanchez.
Although we do not have time today to cover them, our research on the 4 other cities, La Ceiba, Limon, Panama City, and Colón, all highlight diverse and important narratives of Black Central America. For example, in La Ceiba, the tourism industry is forcibly evicting and displacing local Garifuna populations, and several activists fighting against this encroachment are being murdered. And in Panama City, Black feminist movements have been crucial in advocating for the rights and visibility of Afro-Panamanian women, with organizations like Menina Congo, led by Nina Adi, empowering Afro women through workshops and on social and cultural issues, which is helping reshape conversations around race, gender, and class in Panama.
Some key takeaway from our research is that we focus on the interconnected history of Afro-descendant communities in the region. We also emphasize the importance of giving voices to Afro-descendants in discussion about migration, colonialism, and resistance. Lastly, we also highlighted the need to acknowledge the unique experience of Afro-descendants whose narrative have often be excluded. We also want to own in the fact that this is the first phase of a larger project by Dr. White and Dr. Ramsey, our faculty advisor, to create a digital map which will be essential for historians, sociologists, anthropologists, artists, and non-traditional and independent scholars. This will serve to make Black Central American history and culture more visible and acknowledged, and overall potentially fill a long existing gap in Caribbean studies.
We are immensely thankful to the Laidlaw Scholars Foundation, Dr. Melanie White, Dr. Nicole Ramsey, and the Georgetown University Center for Research and Fellowships for providing us with the invaluable opportunity and resources to pursue this research endeavor.
We would also sincerely thank the work of authors, researchers, and individuals who expertise in Black Central American studies as they were instrumental in shaping our work. We also want to thank the CSJ department for allowing us to present our work. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. I'm super excited about this project. I think oftentimes when we think about race, racialization, Blackness in particular, we're extremely US-centric, and so opening up this conversation on global Blackness, global racialization, hugely important. I can't wait to see this digital project that's coming out. Finally, our final Hoya researcher today is Noriko O'Shea, this year's Penner Family Experience Awardee. Through this award, Hoyas are able to participate in experiential learning opportunities in various forums, including fellowships, independent research, laboratory research, fieldwork, community engaged programs, social action, or internships. So with that, please welcome Noriko up.
All right, hello everyone, my name is Noriko. I'm a senior in the SFS majoring in culture and politics and minoring in Japanese. This summer, as a part of the Kolb honors thesis with the support of the Penner Family Experiences Award, I was fortunate enough to travel to the Republic of Palau to conduct research on the impacts of militarization throughout the Pacific. Besides the Penner family, I would also like to express my gratitude for the Culture and Politics Department and their summer studio, my advisor, Dr. Kate Chandler, and my dean, Anthony Perotti, for their support and help in forming this project, the CSJ, and in particular, Dr. Whistler, for allowing me to be here today, and also for her immense support and patience during my slight nightmare of an IRB process. And finally, I wanted to acknowledge all the people that were willing to talk to me, share their stories, and quite literally take me into their homes. So without further ado, I wanted to start by contextualizing Palau's situationship in the Pacific, since it is such a vast region that ultimately, in especially Western academia, we don't know much about. So Palau is located in the Western Pacific. It's about 800 miles from Manila and 2,000 miles from Tokyo. So very different from sort of the generalized image that we have of Polynesia in the Pacific. It has a population of about 20,000 people and is an archipelago comprised of over 300 islands. So for the purpose of my research, I spent 2 weeks in Palau this summer, and I was able to visit 4 different cities/islands. So the first is the southernmost Angar. It's slightly cut off here. It has a permanent population of less than 200 people, and is only about 3 square miles large. And it is the site of the first of 2 US radar construction that's actively happening right now. Right above that, about an hour boat ride away, is Peleliu, which is often referred to by World War II historians as the home of the most inhumane battle of the Pacific Theater. Slightly north of that is Koror. This was previously the capital of the country, but is now more of a business and social hub. It is the home to the majority of Palau's population, and further up northeast on the big island of Babeldob is Melekeok. It is the new home of the governmental capital, which, funnily enough, shares an eerie and intentional resemblance to the United States Capitol. So in these 4 places, I was able to conduct a few interviews and sort of just see everything for myself, because as we'll see, the problem that I wanted to approach through this was when I started my Georgetown career and started forming my CULP concentration, I noticed that there was a severe lack of the Pacific overall in education throughout K-12, throughout America, and also even in the Asia-Pacific field. So the stories and histories of the actual people that this place is rooted in are often overlooked. So for the purposes of this project, I wanted to look into the history of the colonization, occupation, and militarization of the Pacific, and I did this through a case study on the Republic of Palau. So just for additional context on Palau's history, it has experience with 4 different colonial entities, beginning as early as Spain's claiming of Palau in the 1600s, through German occupation, being the sort of outpost of Imperial Japan in the Pacific, and then different forms of administration by the United States. And these all had different layers and extents of resource extraction, full occupation, administration, and then just general spheres of influence. I was most interested at the very beginning of this project with its intersections with climate change, especially as it had to do with displacement, land use, and eventually migration. However, I did figure out very early on that I am in no position to make these connections as a solid thing, so I explore them, but it's not necessarily the focus. The biggest lens through which I wanted to approach these issues was the idea of agency and perspective. So Palau currently is labeled as an independent nation, but is sort of still under the administration of the United States through the Compacts of Free Association, which sort of takes away traditional structures of governments and imposes Western structures, which we'll see has a lot to do with sort of the social changes that have happened since. And the idea of perspective, as a few of the earlier panelists noted, Indigenous tradition is overwhelmingly rooted in oral histories. And most of the recorded histories and stories of the Pacific are written by white men and for white men in the era of quote-unquote exploration. So these are the things that I sort of wanted to challenge. My research question, as it is right now and it's been forming over the last few months, is what are the implications of militarization in the Pacific in regards to cultural connectivity to land and community, and how do the legacies of colonization permeate contemporary society and politics? So the way that I decided to approach this was to truly try to contribute to the recentering of Indigenous experiences and perspectives, especially growing up non-native in Hawaii and understanding my role and my ancestors' roles in sort of just the history of colonization and settlement. I sort of have that understanding of how important these rooted community stories really are. And that really ties into the next point about the sort of sense of reality in global perception. I know that the main image of the Pacific tends to either be somewhere that people vacation, whether it's Hawaii, Palau, Tahiti, places like that, or it's sort of just a vacuum for different global militaries to fight over control of. So that idea of constructing image and the concept of place was really important in this project. So to do so, I started off with an oral history approach, conducting interviews, but I quickly learned that a lot of the things that I was looking at were rooted in stories, but couldn't be limited to that. So I expanded a little bit to include more of firsthand experience that often isn't included in the framing of the Pacific, which I was very intentional about including pictures in these slides. This here is the last standing by, or traditional meeting house, in the entire country of Palau, when each village used to have at least 2. This was sort of located through a hike in someone's backyard, versus this picture is a World War II era tank that I took from my car on the side of the road. So just that relationship between visibility and what things are actually represented as was really important, especially when you sort of get into the idea of how the notion of militarization is so normalized, not even in that sense of the tank was on the side of the road, but also the imposition of Western structures. And that sort of has me pushing into the idea of what does hegemony mean, especially with the United States, and how can we use Pacific values and history and culture to sort of reconstruct how the global order works for people instead of using people. So as a result of my research and the people I talked to and the things that I saw, I sort of learned that the biggest impacts of militarization have been seen in loss of culture, community, and agency. So we see that indigeneity, especially in the Pacific, is overwhelmingly rooted in the land and sea, especially if you look at creation stories and sort of patterns of ancestry. Something that I didn't know until I actually got there was that Palau is one of the only matriarchal and matrilineal societies in the world. So the traditional structures of governance always defer to the elder women. Whether or not the high chiefs were men, it was always rooted in your mother and her mother. So in terms of the development of military infrastructure, the picture on the right is just a slice of that radar construction site. I had the opportunity to go through it with one of my hosts that is actually an environmental consultant on the project, which was really interesting to me as like a native Palauan man. But all of this area used to be full forest, fully just rich and growing. And with the raising of it for the construction, it's had immense consequences in terms of food security, agricultural capacity, jobs, housing, all of that kind of stuff that I unfortunately don't have enough time to get to. And one of the last things that I wanted to focus on in terms of connection to land is this picture right here. This was posted on one of the hikes that I went on and was also the #1 warning on the State Department website when I went to fill out my global travel authorization, which I didn't really know how to fit into my application of how I'm gonna deal with this if I run into it. But it says, caution, unexploded ordnances are prevalent, stay on the trail. There is such a large amount of remnants, what people call artifacts, but mostly just uncleanable wreckage from World War II that cuts off people's access to familial burial grounds, locations of traditional practice, and just completely disrupts daily life. So that idea of how visible these things are in replacing sort of just ideas of history and culture was just baffling to me in the simplest way to say. So I wanted to close this with sort of just an outlook into what the possibilities for demilitarization could mean. This is, I think, one of the most resonating things I heard, whether it was in my formal interviews or just anybody that I talked to. Someone that I met as Auntie Carla, when I was interviewing her about her experiences with the US military, said, we don't need them, they need us. And this sort of just shook me as I started my argument as the United States creating a sense of dependency, but that I realized I was disregarding the strength of indigenous resistance and the value of them being strong, standing there, and maintaining their own culture and connections. So this led me to sort of just think about how community-based and community-rooted most solutions are. And so to continue on with this project, based on feedback I literally got yesterday at our CULP summer studio presentation, I want to use these stories and on-site experiences to root my further project. And just to kind of finish up, I wanted to leave you guys with a quote from Rocky Opp, who is actually a West Papuan activist that I had the privilege to meet at the Protecting Oceania Summit in Oahu this year. He said that the gaps are in the stories we tell. So I wanted to end with that, thinking about how Western knowledge and Western scholarship is not the only mode of knowledge, and that we need to start valuing experiences and stories that are often overlooked. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noriko. As someone who claims to be an expert in global colonialisms, I am ashamed to always be reminded how little I know about colonialism and imperialism in the Pacific. Part of what I was thinking while you're presenting this time is, of course, the operations of U.S. empire abroad are meant to be hidden from those on the mainland. So thank you for visibilizing that for us. I think we have about 10 minutes here for question and answer. Please, let's welcome all of our panelists back on the stage. One more round of applause. And I would love to see how you all would like to engage with them on these wonderful projects.
So sounds like you had a variety of both sort of book, internet, and in-person research experience. I'm curious if you could all just talk about how you thought that impacted your work, either being sort of physically confronted with something, seeing it, in the physical world versus encountering something digitally, and for those who had, they talked about Instagram accounts and sort of that digital presence, how that seemed to maybe blend both worlds. So I'm just curious if you could talk about that physical, digital spectrum of research and encounter in your work.
I mean, I'll start for myself. An unfortunate thing about my research is that it is purely digital. We have incredible partners who are collecting this data in Tulsa, but no one from my lab and I myself have never actually been to Tulsa, Oklahoma. And that is certainly something that I think I'm very aware of in this research, particularly that this is research of low-income, majority POC students in a state that I have never been to. And I am doing that research as a white person and someone who has never experienced the myriad of difficulties associated with being low income. So I think in terms of sort of coping with that balance is, trying to, and I still exist in a predominantly white field. That is the reality of psychology still today, but it is something that's shifting. And so hoping that, although I'm potentially maybe starting this question of transitions in this age group, that hopefully future researchers who have different backgrounds from me will be able to continue this. And I certainly think it would be incredible with this age group. We can't really do a lot of child interviews and things like that. I certainly think that is a potential for the future for researchers who are trained in that area. And I think that would be an incredible kind of more qualitative approach to this research, is really getting these interviews with the teachers, with the students, with the parents. And I think that would just really add a dimension that just this purely digital research is maybe currently lacking.
Yeah, thank you for the question, and that was, I think with our project was focused a lot on using current information that's available. We didn't travel to Central America, but we were really intentional about what we were looking at, being first person and kind of meeting the research where it's at. So that meant a lot of digital organizing, which was very prevalent, was happening. And we could find many social media accounts talking about meetings and activism and solidarity, diasporic solidarity, global solidarity with various movements, and that was very influential in our research, but also because this is such an under-researched field, it was, at least from my experience, very difficult to find information. We were able to, but a lot of it came from deep archives. I had to read a document, a book in Spanish by a professor, or by one of the individuals who started a museum in Panama, and there was just a lot of digging deep into the research that it took. But we were trying to be very intentional about the stories we were representing and make sure to be speaking to their experiences and not to our opinions of them, while also lifting up the women's voices, the Black Indigenous voices, and all.
Yeah, thank you. Just to own into what Ali said, because we were on the same project, there wasn't, especially for my cities, there wasn't a lot of information online, and like she said, we had to dig through deep archives. But I think it also makes it more evident why this project is really important, because there's a lack of knowledge about the cities, and we're adding to hopefully what becomes a closed gap. But yeah, I thought it was a very interesting experience. And yeah.
Thank you. I feel like for me, my project changed so much between doing preliminary research and submitting proposals versus actually being there. I think when I was doing my original reading list, I found maybe 2 or 3 books that were specifically about Palau. So I was sort of just scrambling to draw connections between the limited context that I had, the governmental documents that I could find, and then the theory that I approached it with. So actually being in person and seeing these things and talking to people there really sort of just rounded out the idea that I had and the things that I didn't even consider.
Thank you so much. Hey y'all, this was so cool. Thank you just for coming here and sharing today. I'm also an undergrad, so I had a question about research. All of y'all kind of touched on this idea of like kind of epistemic justice, like looking at other ways, like more just ways to do research itself. And I think that's really awesome because I know at Georgetown, I did like a research fellowship too. And I felt like, I won't speak for y'all, but I felt like there were still like really set ways to do research at Georgetown, like very much like the 20-page paper, like, you know, like all these things you know, epistemic justice, but it still felt like Georgetown really prioritizes some ways of knowledge, like especially when doing deliverables and things. I was just wondering, as you were doing research yourself, what like moments did you have or things you did that you really felt were like other ways of knowledge, like for yourself, that really felt valuable? Like how did you feel yourself kind of learn new ways of knowing or new ways of research, like in this project that you're hoping to carry forward?
I think the biggest thing for me actually came in my IRB process and learning that I had the flexibility of how to approach consent and structuring interviews. I was very nervous about going into interviews with the standards of you have to have these explicit questions, this very like standard consent, all of that kind of stuff, and I knew that wouldn't really mesh well with sort of like the atmosphere and the approach of knowledge in the Pacific. So I was really lucky to be able to do a little bit more of an informal interview. And I think I just learned that like learning isn't the same because it's not necessarily these facts and these things that happen throughout history, but it's passed on through stories and experiences and families. So everyone that I talked to had similar things to say, but from very different perspectives.
I think for me, one prominent time I can remember was like, so we had 3 cities each, and every 2 weeks we're supposed to report on those cities. And I think my second one was Limon, Costa Rica, and there's a lot of limited resources when it comes to that city. And I was running through the end of the second week, and I still didn't feel like I had like sufficient knowledge to write my report. So I emailed my faculty advisor. I was like, I can't turn this in right now. I don't think I'm representing this story as well as I could, and I asked for an extension. So it's just honestly, if you have an advisor, talk to your advisor. Like, don't feel obligated to like submit that deadline when it is. You know what I'm saying? If you feel like you haven't accurately represented what you want to, talk to them. And research is ongoing. Like I understand, like some of us have timeline. Like for Layla, it was 6 weeks, but I went into the 7th week. So just and if it's an independent project, like she said, you have some type of flexibility about how you want to approach this.
Yeah, definitely seconding that. For both of us, it was our first research experience, so we were kind of learning on the go and really trying to figure things out. Thankfully, we had really phenomenal guidance from our 2 research advisors, Dr. Ramsey and Dr. White. They really helped with pacing and everything, which I know is a very difficult thing sometimes. But with the research itself, something that I found that I learned, especially with our database of information being so small, is learning to kind of put together the hidden narratives, because the people who are writing about this are often like from the US observing. But for example, in La Ceiba, there's not a lot of documentation of the activism that's happening there, but there is documentation of activists who are fighting against tourism industries dying and being killed. So you can put together these narratives, these kind of hidden things that are not being talked about, and really think about these stories and how much more to them there is than what we're seeing, because they weren't documented in the way that I guess like traditional research or things in the US, especially like scholarly knowledge, is typically presented. So that was definitely a learning curve.
Thank you so much for the question. I think seconding a point made earlier about accessibility, certainly my trajectory in research at Georgetown has had its ups and downs. I think as I alluded to slightly in my presentation, I was unable to complete the ESJ fellowship twice, both of them, because my health would not permit it. And I think just, being able to go through that experience with an incredible community that was always there supporting me and wanted the best for my health, but also prioritizing, kind of mental health. How do I, if I'm not able to do this, is there anything else that I can be working on that, will kind of give me that same sense of fulfillment? And yeah, I think certainly, and then, I was very grateful to have been provided the Provost Fellowship and be able to do research in my lab, and I think a great lesson with that was sort of learning how to show up in the ways that work for you, and that as incredible as the ESJ Fellowship is, the kind of intensive 3 weeks of field work probably is something that I would not have been able to do physically, but I can sit at my computer in my lab over the summer on my own time and conduct my research through that. And so I think, finding the modes that suit you and so you can show up in the best way.
Thank you all. Phenomenal, I learned so much. Noriko, you made it. In my personal attempt to not be completely taken over by the US presidential election, I know that there's also a presidential election in other places in the world, including Palau. So I was just curious if anything came up for you from the folks you talked to, from what you saw on the streets, that you know about what this presidential election is like, given the relationship that Palau has with the United States, where we are right now.
Yeah, so it's actually really interesting because I was there for American Independence Day and for Palau's Constitution Day, and it was really interesting to see how just sort of political messaging and stuff that we're so used to seeing in the US is not as significant of a deal on the streets in Palau. The most that I saw and that I heard from people about, overwhelmingly people do support the re-election of President Whips. And one person that I interviewed, her father was the high chief of part of the village that I visited. And she was talking about how he was one of the largest voices against the compacts in their original form, but her family did support the re-election of President Whips, and it was largely because while he did, and he has a track record of, he was born in America, and he has very good relationships with senators in the US Senate and our sort of just political governance, he has also been a strong voice for Palauan sovereignty and maintaining Palauan values and sort of just structures within sort of the Western system. So it was actually really interesting to see that both of those could exist in sort of a different form.
Can I ask another question? Can I ask the Laidlaw scholars? I'm really interested in, so when you showed your map, you have your different cities. And when I did my doctoral research years ago, I was like, oh, that reminds me of when I did that. It was in the southeastern Europe, and there was all these different cities. And something that affected me then, 2005, 20 years ago, was the flows of information, culturally and otherwise, in between those cities, which were technically in different countries, but often the cities themselves that you were talking to probably have more in relationship to each other across borders than with other cities within the borders. So I'm just curious if there was relationships across the cities with the Afro-Caribbean populations and communities that you were researching, if you saw any of that happening.
Yeah, definitely. For me, so I was in charge of Livingston, Limon, and Panama City, and one of the main similarities that I saw was means of resistance. They created maroon societies. They use education as resistance. They also use artistic expressions as resistance. So those were very prevalent for me because they all have different cultures, but in a way they use that as a mean to fight against colonialism, basically. And also some of the organizations that I saw were we're similar in a way of what they fought for, which is like fighting for the voices of Afro-descendant people living there. So, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think a lot of the movements and the fighting and the maroonage, all of that stuff was pretty consistent across the board. Additionally, recognition, the fight for recognition, whether that's from the government, from for their land, all of those things, that was also very consistent and a very active conversation that is happening, because there are a lot of places where just Afro-descendant people are not recognized at all, especially in like San Miguel, where they're not recognized by the government as a population, despite 7,000 plus people self-identifying as Afro-descendant. So it's a lot of those kind of conversations that need to be having, and activists who are really fighting together to make sure their stories are being told. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, well, I think we're out of time here, so let's definitely know how Ryan.
You guys can go ahead and go back to your. Okay. All right. What an incredible display of curiosity, exploration, and analysis. I'm invigorated by the generative nature of these new ideas and findings and look forward to seeing them blossom. Thank you so much to every supporter and donor of these social justice-centered programs. The work that was presented today is a wonderful example of engaged scholarship. This is what happens when you integrate an educational research opportunity by addressing a community need. Our student researchers today showed us how they carefully navigated ethical, participatory research to serve the communities that were generous enough to share their stories and lives with them. To Hoyas who have joined us, a reminder that our applications for the 2025 Education and Social Justice Fellowship opens today. The ASJA application is due by 5 p.m. on Friday, October 25th. We are hosting information sessions on this research opportunity virtually on Wednesday, October 2nd, one at 8 a.m. Eastern Time and again at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Hoyas can RSVP using the QR code or by visiting the CSJ's website. I'm realizing I need to pull up that QR code. Let me share slides again. Here we go. There's the QR code. So the 2025 ESJ Fellows will be announced in early December 2024. CSJ's Andretta Fellowship applications will be opening in late September with a deadline in early November. Applications for the Laidlaw, Kalorama, Raines, and Provost Fellowships open later in the fall and will have spring semester deadlines. Please keep an eye out for these opportunities and don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you, researchers. Thank you, guests, virtual and in person, for joining us today. I also want to thank the individuals who prepared the space for us and will clean the space up for those of us after we leave, whose invisible labor makes our gatherings and intellectual explorations possible today. Yes, thank you. As I close today, I'm grateful for being in this intellectual community with all of you to support our student researchers. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming.